Hello and welcome everyone. Today's video is all about a deceivingly simple element of music production and composition, the sine wave. In the first part of this video, we'll have a look at past and contemporary uses of sine waves in music composition, as well as the most important synthesis patches using sine waves in music production. The second part of the video is focused on the practical applications, as usual. And so for this video, I decided to create a short dance music track only based on sine waves. Even though we can think of any existing sound as a sum of sine waves, it is practically impossible to encounter pure sine waves in nature. Only with the advent of electronic synthesizers around the mid of the 20th century was it really possible to create those pure audible sine waves and use them in music. One sound artist often referenced for his work with sine waves is Alvin Lucier. A portion of his work in particular was exploring the tremolo-like beatings that are created when two sine waves are close but not identical in frequency. His compositions combined sweeping sine waves that were perceived to be pulsing when combined with the correct fundamental frequencies played on piano, string, or orchestral instruments. There's a great paper by Bernier et al. From 2023 that analyzes the questionnaire response of 87 sound artists and composers sharing their influences and their inspirations and thoughts on sine wave compositions. One particular graph, shown here, is a great overview if you're looking for more composers experimenting with sine waves, including Stockhausen, Oliveros, or Xenakis. In the interest of time, I only want to single out the name Marianne Amacher, who worked extensively in the field of autoacoustics. Autoacoustic emissions are sounds purely created in the inner ear, so that the music that you hear is noticeably different than the actual sounds being played through the speakers. It mostly works at really loud playback volumes, but it's a really crazy phenomenon. Marianne Amacher explored this extensively in her music compositions, and even nowadays physicists are looking into the use of inaudible ultrasound waves to create perceivable sounds directly in your eardrums. I already mentioned this paper by Bernier et al. Bernier sent out a questionnaire to 200 sound artists about their inspirations and own artistic use of sine waves. He analyzed the replies of the 87 sound artists that responded and structured the findings in some nifty graphs like this. What I like about this graph is that it really shows the immense number of approaches that can be taken when working creatively with something as simple as a sine wave. From ontological, scientific, or philosophical links all the way to aesthetic implications, there's a ton of room for exploration. As a composer myself, I'm particularly interested in the aesthetic approach of dualistic posture. In particular, in my piece 56FE, I'm contrasting a number of sine waves and white noise, morphing in between both extremes using opening and closing bandpass filters. I created these sounds using a music patch I coded myself on a computer, but even just running white or colored noise through a spectral processor can be the basis for a ton of exploration. So if we now move away from art music and into music production, we will quickly realize that sine waves are ubiquitous here as well. Most of your 808 drums are modulated sine waves, kick drums are sine waves with a pitch envelope, snares are 2 tuned sine waves and some noise, and the hi-hats are 6 sine waves in a trench coat. The list goes on. FM synthesis is based purely on clever modulation of sine waves with other sine waves, and additive synthesis is just the sum of 10 to up to thousands of different sine waves to create complex sounds. In other words, sine waves are everywhere in music production, and for good reason. With all of that being said, now it's the time to get a bit more practical. As you know, limitations in music making forces us to leave our ways of composing and forces us to explore new methodologies. You can do this in many ways. Say you could only use one sound, synth, or focus on one extended technique throughout a full composition. So how about this? In today's practical part, I'm creating a dance music track from only sine waves and nothing else. Here are the rules. Once I make a particular sound with a sine wave, I am allowed to record and reuse that sound. I have essentially unlocked that new sound, like in a video game. Cutting, time stretching, or other sample-based techniques are allowed, but I will use them sparingly. I know that it is technically possible to create any sounds via additive synthesis, so I will only create one sound based on additive synthesis with a limit of 6 sine waves maximum. Once all elements of the track are created, I am then allowed to arrange them in a DAW and use basic mixing and mastering tools such as EQ, compression, and reverb to polish the track. I will count how many sine waves I needed to create each sound and how many sine waves were needed in total. Alright, let's get started. So the first thing I needed to do was to turn some sine waves into usable envelopes. For synthesizing my percussions, I needed envelopes that are decaying really fast, and I created those envelopes by having one sine wave modulate another, resulting in somewhat more triangle-shaped envelope that I could use in the next step. With that envelope saved, we can now just go to any sine wave and control the oscillator frequency with this envelope to get our first sound resembling a kick. For me, the envelope was a bit too linear in its decay, so what I did was I used the envelope to modulate itself and basically speed up the beginning of the envelope and slow down during the end, which gave me a bit more of an exponential shape. With that exponential shape into the oscillator frequency of my sine wave generator and a bit of fine tuning, I was basically set to create my kick drum. In order to create my snare and hi-hats, I needed a bit of noise. The easiest way to make noise from sine waves is to have a couple of sine waves, maybe 3 to 6, and have them modulate each other. If there's enough sine waves that control each other, the resulting sound will be quite chaotic and non-periodic, and it's this non-periodicity that we perceive as noise. So with a bit of fine-tuning, we got a lot of different flavors of noise. I cut them up and I put them into my Bitbox Micro for further processing. So for this patch again, I'm using my sine waves I recorded on the FMR as control signals to get me those attack release envelopes to shape the volume curve of my snare drums. For my snare drums, I'm basically using the 909 synthesis setup of having 2 sine waves at different frequencies mixed with a bit of noise. Both sine waves are summed up before being thrown into a VCA and volume controlled via an envelope, and then mixed with white noise that has a bit of a shorter volume envelope. And with a bit of fine tuning, you again can get a few different flavors of snare drums. For these patches, the flavor of noise and the frequencies of the snares is everything. So I was experimenting with combining different flavors of noise with different frequency combinations on the sine waves. So the heights again are based on common synthesis design. In this case here, I'm using 6 sine waves that are modulating each other, effectively creating noise. But because of the strict volume envelope I am applying, we get these kind of hi-hat-ish sounds that you can hear here. And of course, if you're creating your own hi-hats from scratch, you can also experiment with all its synthesis parameters. So in this case here, I was messing around with the volume control, giving me a few more interesting hi-hat or like noise patterns that didn't make it into the final composition, but I thought were interesting nonetheless. To create the bass line, I once again started with 2 sine waves as control sources. One was controlling the volume envelope, and the other sine wave was quantized in the FMR to give me melodic steps. I used 2 sine waves roughly an octave apart, but I've overdriven them so once they hit the VCA, they're not showing up as 2 sine waves, but they're being distorted into more of a square wave sound. And honestly, with this kind of setup, I was jamming around making so many different leads and bass lines, which is almost a shame that only a few of them can make it into the final track, which is why I'm showing a few more here. Lastly, I wanted to create a background pad, and the easiest way of doing this is to layer a couple of sine waves on top of another. As you can hear here, organs are quite easy to make from just a few sine waves, because organs produce sine waves that are essentially an octave apart each, which was very easy to recreate in Eurorack. In my final track, I was not using the full organ sound, but I was messing around with only having a few of those sine waves active at a given time. Alright, and with all those sounds ready to go, the last thing we have to do is arrange them in a track. Let's do it.